The data analysts at NBC thought something had gone seriously wrong. It was the night of the All-Star broadcast, and they were doing what they always do, monitoring viewership in real time, watching the numbers tick, tracking engagement across platforms. Except the numbers were not ticking, they were exploding. Not gradually, not in the slow, organic climb you expect from a well-promoted broadcast. These were vertical spikes, the kind that look like a server glitch or a bot surge or some kind of feed error that needs to be diagnosed and corrected immediately. So they ran diagnostics. They checked every metric twice, then a third time, because what they were seeing did not match any pattern they had observed before. And when they finally confirmed that everything was functioning exactly as it should, they had to sit with a reality that was almost harder to accept than a technical malfunction. Caitlin Clark had been on screen for less than 10 minutes, and she was outperforming the NBA players who were supposed to be the main event. Her analysis segment was generating more social media engagement than highlight reels from the All-Star competition itself. Clips of her breaking down plays were moving faster across platforms than footage of dunks and alley-oops from some of the most recognizable names in professional basketball. Comment sections were flooding, share counts were climbing, and the sentiment pouring in from hundreds of thousands of viewers was telling the same story from every direction. People had tuned in for the All-Star game. They had stayed for Caitlin Clark. What NBC had just witnessed was not a feel-good moment or a diversity win or a calculated programming risk that happened to pay off. What they had witnessed was star power in its rawest, most undeniable form, the kind that does not need context or explanation, the kind that hits you the moment it appears on screen and refuses to let go, the kind that either exists in a person or it does not, and in Caitlin Clark, it exists at a level that the sports world had genuinely not prepared itself for. But here is where the story stops being a celebration and starts being something far more complicated. Because while NBC executives were processing the data and realizing they had just made one of the smartest programming decisions in recent sports media history, there were people inside the WNBA watching this exact same moment unfold with a very different reaction. Not pride, not excitement. Not the kind of enthusiasm you might expect from a league that had just seen one of its own players command a prime-time audience in ways nobody had anticipated. According to multiple sources with direct knowledge of internal conversations happening at the time, what certain prominent figures inside the league were feeling was something much closer to alarm. And understanding why requires understanding what the WNBA was built to believe about itself and about the kind of growth it was supposed to pursue. Since its founding, the WNBA has operated under a philosophy that was presented as both a strategic and ideological commitment. Growth was supposed to be collective. The league would rise together, uniformly, with every team and every player lifted by the same rising tide. Marketing focused on the sport as a whole rather than on individual personalities. Media partnerships were structured around the league's brand, not around specific athletes. Stars were celebrated, yes, but always within a framework that made clear the league itself was the product. The message was consistent, and it was deliberate. No single player was supposed to be bigger than the game. That was the model. That was the promise. That was the identity the WNBA had spent nearly 3 decades building and protecting. And then, Caitlin Clark arrived and dismantled the entire thing without a single word of complaint or a single demand for special treatment. She did not walk into the WNBA asking for anything. She did not push for individual marketing campaigns or special media access or contract structures that reflected her drawing power. She showed up, she practiced, she competed, and she played basketball at a level that made it physically impossible to look away from her. She stayed after sessions perfecting a three-pointer that she was launching from distances that most professional players would not even attempt. She threaded passes through impossibly tight windows with a vision that left teammates and opponents both shaking their heads. She brought a competitive intensity onto the court that translated through television cameras the same way certain performers translate through a film lens. There is something happening there that equipment can capture, but that no marketing department can manufacture. Audiences felt it instantly, and they responded in ways that the WNBA had never experienced before in its entire history. Tickets to Indiana Fever games began selling out months in advance, not days, months.
Websites crashed under the demand. Secondary market prices for fever games climbed to levels that would have seemed like satire if someone had predicted them just 2 years earlier. People who had never watched a single WNBA game in their lives were subscribing to streaming services specifically because they wanted to watch her play. Arenas that had spent years struggling to fill their lower sections were suddenly turning people away. And the extraordinary thing, the detail that reveals exactly how significant this moment was, is that this was not happening because the WNBA had finally figured out the right marketing approach, or because some campaign had successfully educated casual sports fans about the quality of women's basketball. It was happening because one person had made people care. One player had given millions of viewers a reason to invest emotionally in something they had previously ignored entirely. The collective growth model, the philosophy the league had built its entire identity around, collapsed under the weight of a single, undeniable truth. People do not fall in love with institutions, they fall in love with people.
The data that accumulated in the hours and days following the NBC broadcast confirmed what anyone watching had already felt in real time. Clark's segment did not just perform well against reasonable expectations, it performed better than content featuring the NBA players who were the scheduled stars of the broadcast itself. Across every platform where engagement could be measured, the pattern was the same. Her clips spread faster, her moments generated more conversation, her presence commanded more sustained attention. NBC executives who had taken what looked from the outside like a mildly interesting programming gamble suddenly looked like the smartest people in the room. They had understood something before most of the industry was ready to say it out loud. This was not a player you featured as a special guest or a symbolic gesture toward women's sports. This was a figure whose commentary, whose analysis, whose actual thoughts on the game of basketball had become worth more to a mass audience than the performances of players competing in the sport's most celebrated annual showcase. This distinction matters enormously, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. There is a hierarchy in sports media influence that most athletes never climb. At the bottom, you have players who people watch. Above that, you have players who people follow. Above that, you have players who people care about, deeply enough to seek out beyond the games themselves. And at the very top, a level that almost nobody reaches, you have athletes who become cultural voices, people whose perspective on the sport carries weight, regardless of what competition they're currently involved in. People whose insights are considered valuable, not because of the platform they are on, but because of who they are. Caitlin Clark had crossed into that tier. Not gradually, not through years of media training and carefully managed public appearances. She crossed into it on a Tuesday night at the NBA All-Star game while wearing a suit and talking about basketball strategy. And the sports world, to varying degrees of comfort depending on who you asked, had to reckon with what that meant. Now let us talk about what was actually being said in private, because the public statements from league officials were predictable enough. Record viewership, unprecedented growth, historic engagement. All technically accurate, all carefully worded to center the league rather than the individual. But according to sources who were inside the conversations that were not meant for public consumption, the mood in certain corners of the WNBA was starkly different from the celebratory press releases. Group chats among prominent players were active. Private conversations were happening at levels that suggested genuine distress rather than minor irritation. And the concern being expressed was not about anything Caitlin Clark had said or done incorrectly. She had been professional, she had been thoughtful, she had represented herself and the sport with the kind of intelligence and class that should have made anyone in the league proud. The discomfort was not about her conduct, it was about her scale. It was about the precedent her NBC moment was setting and the questions it forced everyone in the league to confront about how things were supposed to work. The specific concern, as it has been reported by those familiar with these internal discussions, centered on the idea of precedent. If Caitlin Clark becomes the face of women's basketball in mainstream media, not just in WNBA circles, but in the broader sports conversation, then the entire structure of how the league presents itself to the world has to be reconsidered.
If she is the one receiving invitations to major network broadcasts, being sought out as a basketball authority by mainstream media outlets, being positioned as the figure that casual fans connect to when they think about women's basketball, then what happens to every other player in the league? What happens to the collective identity that the WNBA has spent decades constructing? What happens to the players who came before her, who gave their careers to building something, who were told that individual stardom was not the goal, and who operated accordingly? These were not irrational questions, they were uncomfortable ones. But there is a meaningful difference between a question being uncomfortable and a question being wrong. And the people asking these questions were, perhaps without fully intending to, revealing something important about how the league had been operating and why it had been struggling. Here is the reality that Clark's rise has forced into the open. The WNBA's collective growth philosophy was not just a marketing strategy, it was presented as a moral position. Players were told that pursuing individual stardom was somehow in tension with the health of the league, that superstar marketing created inequality and resentment, that the right approach, the ethical approach, the approach that would sustain the sport long-term, was to distribute attention as evenly as possible across all teams and all players in all markets. This philosophy was taught and forced and internalized across decades of league culture. And what Caitlin Clark has demonstrated simply by existing and playing basketball at the level she plays it is that this philosophy may have been one of the primary reasons the league spent 25 years failing to break through to mainstream American sports culture in any sustained way. She has proven, with actual data, with actual attendance figures, with actual subscription numbers and ticket prices and television ratings, that one transcendent star can do more for the visibility and commercial health of women's basketball than a quarter-century of collective marketing ever managed to achieve. And that proof is extraordinarily threatening to people who built their identities around the idea that the collective approach was the correct one.
The WNBA's public response to all of this has followed a very specific and revealing pattern. Every time Clark breaks a viewership record, the narrative quickly pivots to how the entire league is benefiting. Every time she sells out an arena, the story becomes about renewed interest in women's basketball broadly. Every time her presence drives a measurable spike in some commercial metric, the framing shifts to the WNBA's overall growth story, rather than to the individual responsible for generating it. Her achievements get absorbed into the collective. Her drawing power gets distributed across the league's brand. And while there is genuine truth to the claim that her impact lifts the tide for everyone, there is also something deliberate happening in this constant reframing, something that looks very much like an institutional resistance to acknowledging that the WNBA now has a superstar whose commercial power operates on a completely different level than anyone else in the league's history. Because acknowledging that reality creates obligations, it demands structural changes. It requires a conversation about whether the old model needs to be abandoned entirely in favor of something built around the reality of who Caitlin Clark actually is. If she is acknowledged as the generational player that the evidence clearly shows her to be, then the league has to change how it markets itself. It has to change how it structures media partnerships. It has to potentially revisit how revenue gets distributed and how individual players are compensated relative to the commercial value they generate. It has to answer questions that are embarrassing to answer. Why did it take someone coming from outside your existing system to create this level of mainstream engagement? Why were you unable to develop or promote your existing stars to achieve even a fraction of this commercial impact? What does it say about your scouting, your player development, your marketing philosophy, and your leadership that one player entering your league from college basketball did more for your visibility in her first season than the entire organization had done in the previous decade combined? These are not rhetorical questions. They are the logical conclusions that follow from the data. And they are questions the league's leadership has powerful incentives to avoid answering directly. The NBC All-Star broadcast was not just a viewership story, it was a power story.
It was a moment where the carefully maintained separation between the world Caitlin Clark was supposed to occupy and the world of mainstream sports media became suddenly and visibly negotiable. She was not positioned that night as a representative of women's basketball making a symbolic appearance. She was positioned as a basketball mind worth listening to, a voice with authority, an analyst whose perspective added genuine value to a broadcast designed for the broadest possible sports audience. And the audience responded by confirming every single thing her supporters had been saying. They engaged, they shared, they commented, they lingered. They treated her presence not as a novelty, but as a feature, not as a guest appearance, but as a reason to watch. And in the economics of sports media, that distinction is everything. It is the difference between being someone a network invites as a favor and being someone a network needs because their audience demands it. The boundaries that have defined the space between men's and women's professional basketball for decades did not just bend that night. They became, for the first time, genuinely questionable. And for the people who had built their careers and their identities within those boundaries, who had positioned themselves as the relevant authorities within their designated lane, the possibility that those boundaries might be collapsing was not exciting, it was existential. Because if Caitlin Clark exists beyond the category of women's basketball, if she operates in the broader conversation about basketball as a sport and culture and media phenomenon, then the leverage that comes from controlling her narrative within the women's game diminishes significantly. You cannot manage someone who has already outgrown the box you were trying to keep them in. And that is precisely what the NBC broadcast confirmed. She had already outgrown it. The box was just the last to notice. What you are watching unfold in real time is not just the rise of an extraordinary basketball player. It is a genuine restructuring of power within a professional sports league. The people who held influence under the old model are watching that influence erode, not because of anything malicious or conspiratorial, but because the market is responding to something they cannot replicate or suppress. The fans who are filling arenas and subscribing to streaming services and paying secondary market prices for tickets are not doing so because of league policy or marketing campaigns or carefully crafted collective narratives. They are doing so because of one person, and that person cannot be controlled, cannot be diminished, and cannot be fit back into a framework that her very existence has made obsolete. The institutions built around women's basketball now face a choice that their leadership has been visibly reluctant to make. They can acknowledge what is actually happening and restructure accordingly, accepting that the new model looks fundamentally different from the old one and requires them to cede certain forms of control, or they can continue insisting that the old rules apply while the world they were built to govern transforms around them. The question is not whether Caitlin Clark has already changed women's basketball permanently. That question has been answered. She has. The records are there. The attendance figures are there. The subscription data is there. The NBC broadcast data is there. The question that remains open, the one that will define the next several years of the WNBA's history, is whether the people responsible for running this league are capable of telling themselves the truth about what created this moment and what it demands of them going forward. Whether they can set aside the ideology and the identity and the decades of institutional commitment to a model that Clark has exposed as insufficient, whether they are willing to build something new that actually reflects the reality their own data is showing them. That is the story worth watching, not the highlights, not the records, not the social media numbers, the institutional response to an undeniable force that nobody inside the building was fully prepared to handle. Because what happens next will determine whether the WNBA becomes one of the great growth stories in professional sports history, or whether it becomes a cautionary tale about what happens when an institution chooses its own comfort over its own future.